California. For decades, it was the symbol of the American dream. But according to one author, it's now become a cautionary tale of a government basically in paralysis. So, what happened? We're about to dive into a really fascinating and, pretty provocative opinion piece that argues the state's entire foundation, its constitution, has completely crumbled. Okay, let's get into it. Now, before we go any further, it's super important to be clear that everything we're about to explore comes straight from an opinion article in the Shasta Beacon. Our job here isn't to take sides, but just to break down the author's perspective and the arguments they're making. So, the author kicks things off by painting a picture of two completely different Californias. On one side, you've got the dream we all know, innovation, opportunity, just endless possibility. But on the other side is the reality they see today. Costs that are just skyrocketing, a mass exodus of people, and infrastructure that's literally crumbling. The big question the article asks is, how did the Golden State lose its shine? And the piece argues that these problems aren't just, a random string of bad luck. Nope. They're symptoms of a much, much deeper issue, a total failure in how the state is actually governed. And this brings us to what the author says is the main culprit, California's Constitution itself. And we're not talking about the original from 1849. We're talking about its replacement from 1879, which the article claims has turned into an absolute monster. And to understand why they call it a monster, you just have to look at the numbers. The Constitution has been amended more than 525 times. That is more than any other state in the country. And it's not just the number of changes, it's the sheer length. We're talking 75,000 words. It's one of the longest governing documents on the entire planet. A constitution is supposed to be a blueprint, right? But the author argues that California's has become this massive encyclopedia of conflicting rules, all because the public just doesn't trust the legislature to govern anymore. The author uses this fantastic phrase, chaotic patchwork, to describe what's happened. All these voter-approved initiatives, propositions, have been stitched directly into the Constitution. This creates a mess where different rules clash, which basically handcuffs the elected officials who are supposed to be in charge. And this really gets to the core of the author's argument. They pull out this quote from James Madison to say, look, California has strayed so far from these foundational principles. It's eroded the separation of powers and the whole idea of a representative republic, where elected officials are supposed to be the ones making complex laws, not just direct votes on everything. So, how did this all happen? Well, the article points its finger at one specific thing, the proposition system, which it says has created what it calls a fiscal trap. So what is a fiscal trap? According to the article, it's when these ballot propositions become constitutional law, locking in spending and tax rules pretty much forever. The legislature loses its power to budget or adapt to new challenges. The two biggest examples they cite are Prop 13, which capped property taxes, and Prop 98, which walls off a huge chunk of the budget for education. And this chart really puts it all into perspective. Because of Proposition 98, about 40% of California's state budget is just automatically locked away for education. Now, that might be a great goal, but the author argues this rigidity means that when the economy takes a nosedive, lawmakers can't make adjustments. Their hands are completely tied. And hey, it's not just this one author making this case. The article points out that even California's former top judge, Chief Justice Ronald George, called the system dysfunctional all the way back in 2009. This is a really sharp critique from the article. The author argues that this whole initiative process, which was supposed to empower regular citizens against big corporations, has been totally flipped on its head. Now they say it's just a tool for wealthy special interests to go around the legislature and literally write their own laws. And here is the author's Exhibit A. Over $200 million was spent on Proposition 22. That was the initiative that let ride-sharing companies classify their drivers as contractors. The article uses this to argue that, a lot of the time, victory on the ballot just goes to whoever has the deepest pockets. So after this pretty grim diagnosis, what's the cure? Well, the author contends that small fixes are totally useless. They say the problem is so fundamental that the state needs to think about some truly drastic action. And they lay out two possible paths forward. Path 1, rewrite. Just tear up the current constitution and start completely fresh with a new constitutional convention. Path 2, redraw. Acknowledge that the state is just too divided and split it up into 2 or more new states. The first idea, a new convention, would be a monumental undertaking. The goal would be to slash those 75,000 words, get rid of all the conflicting mandates, and give the legislature back its power to actually legislate. The author notes this isn't some brand new idea, pointing to things like the Repair California campaign from 2010. But, getting everyone to agree on a new framework today, that would be an enormous challenge. But what if the state's divisions, rural versus urban, coast versus inland, are just too deep to be fixed by a new document? Well, this leads us to the second and far more radical solution that the article brings up. The piece zooms in on the new California state movement. It's a grassroots effort, mostly in rural and inland counties, and it's driven by this belief that they're being ruled by coastal elites who just don't share their values or their interests. For them, the only way to get real representation is to form their own state, kind of like how West Virginia split from Virginia. And this isn't just some historical footnote. The article makes it clear this movement is very active right now, even holding a major conference this week up in Shasta County. It really highlights that these tensions are boiling over today. So we end up right where the article leaves us. It presents this incredibly stark choice, arguing that to restore a functioning government for its people, California is facing a massive decision. Either take on the huge political challenge of rewriting its rules, or embrace the truly radical act of redrawing its borders. It's a fascinating and pretty heavy question to think about.